HBTV. I'm Harry Binswanger, the HB in HBTV. Today, we're talking about a single sentence that Ayn Rand uttered that captures the entire philosophy of objectivism. It's a kind of statement that no one else would ever make, not even Aristotle, both in style and in content. The statement is, I'm not brave enough to be a coward. I see the consequences too clearly. This is a statement she made when she was to testify to the House Un-American Activities Committee about communist influence and communist propaganda in the movies. And she was told that to cooperate with the committee would be dangerous to her professionally. Of course, she didn't face a lot of threat there because the Fountainhead was out. And once that had been a bestseller, and once that had happened, nothing was going to stop her. But it could have made her life a lot harder. The pressure, because this was the period in which Hollywood was, like today, really dominated by communists. But back then, the communists were card-carrying members of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And the committee, incidentally, which has been defamed by leftists as a witch hunt, the hearings that unfriendly witnesses were appearing in, that is communists, always ended with the committee producing their Communist Party membership card. So these witches were not witches, they were cockroaches, and they were real. Witches being imaginary. So she said, I'm not brave enough to be a coward. I see the consequences too clearly. How does that encapsulate the whole philosophy of objectivism? Well, let's look at each branch of philosophy. At least the first three: metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. In metaphysics, what does it mean to say, I'm not brave enough to be a coward, I see the consequences too clearly? It means a raft of things. It means the whole objectivist metaphysics, including that consciousness is awareness of that which exists. It means the consequences are real. There are things out there that cannot be wished away, and that they are what they are, that A is A. The consequences of bowing to political pressure, like in today's cancel culture, this was the ancestor of that. The consequences of giving into pressure would exist, she thought, whether or not she recognized them. They're independent of consciousness. That's the principle known as the primacy of existence over consciousness. She might refuse to see them, but they're still going to be there and do her in if she doesn't deal with them. Now, readers of the Fountainhead know what scene makes the same point. I suppose there's not just one scene, but there's one that's famous for this. Rourke has his last chance, Rourke the architect, the hero of the book, who's been shunned by practically all the establishment professionals and hirers of architects. He has his last chance at the Manhattan Bank building. If he doesn't get this commission, he will be flat broke and without hope of earning any money in the near future. So they agree, the board of directors of the Manhattan Bank building agreed to build the building on his terms. They give him the commission on one condition, Mr. Rourke, and he glares at them, waiting for them to go on. We want to just make a few changes in the facade. And they came out with a drawing or a model in the movie that shows a Greek motif, columns and string courses and cartouches and everything being put on over the front of his modern, Frank Lloyd Wright inspired, really, architecture, bastardizing it, ruining it. It was just hideous. And they asked him, will you accept those conditions? And he could have said, no, I'm not brave enough to be a coward and give in here. I see the consequences too clearly. But all he did was turn it down, try to speak to them about why a building had to be all of a piece and had to have an integrity, just as a man does, and for the same reason. But they told him, look, our decision is final. It's yes or no. You can't argue with this anymore. The board has approved it with this condition, and it's not open for further discussion. Yes or no? And he says no. And they ask him, are you aware of what you're doing? And he says, fully. Then one of them says, do you have to be so fanatical and selfless about it? And he said, what? You have to be so fanatical and selfless about it. And he says, that's the most selfish thing you've ever seen a man do. That's the same attitude. I'm not brave enough to be a coward because I see the consequences too clearly. Rourke saw what it would mean for his future, if he's to have any future. If he allowed his work to be bastardized in this way that made it ugly beyond redemption, it would mean that people who might be attracted to his work, people of authentic independence and good taste and good judgment, would be turned off. So in selling out to get money, he would be putting up a monument to bad architecture in his name. And it would have been, of course, the most famous thing he'd ever done. He hadn't had any large projects by that time. And it would have blackened his reputation with the people he cared about, not the man on the street who wouldn't know what to think, but the men of authentic, independent vision who could recognize greatness when they saw it. He had to remain pure in order to have a future to reach his kind of audience. It's as if Ayn Rand were to ask to, and I'm sure she was many times, to insert some softening touches into her novels, or to come out with an appeasement of religion. If she had betrayed the consistency of a philosophy that stresses consistency, it would have soured people such as myself from pursuing this philosophy. So you can't act treasonably towards your own values and then expect to go on succeeding. And that's what the metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics of that statement are, but we're going to have to unpack it more. So metaphysically, that is in the branch of philosophy that discusses the nature of reality as such, the meaning of the brave enough to be a coward statement is existence is an absolute. The effects of your choice are the effects of your choice. They will have further effects that will redound upon your efforts throughout time. So you can't wish them away. You can't refuse to see them. They are what they are, and they will be, there's cause and effect. You introduce the cause, the effect is going to happen. Now that alone runs counter to everything going on in the world today. For instance, economists knew when, if the public didn't, when Trump's $3.6 trillion spending proposal was to be voted on. They could have advocated, no, this will lead to inflation. Don't do this. Don't spend this amount of money, which you don't have. You're raining money down from helicopters, is what's called helicopter money, with nothing to back it up. There's no real goods. It's just paper. And when that paper gets spent, eventually it's going to raise prices. That's pretty well known and understood. But they thought, well, this time it's different. That's the motto of the person who thinks he can escape the consequences. This time it's different. Well, it wasn't different. And we're now suffering the consequences of that, including the stock market slide. Okay, so metaphysics, the meaning of the statement is things are what they are. The effects will be what they are. My only choice is to perceive them or to try to fake them, which comes down to perceive them or pretend I didn't perceive them. What about epistemology? Epistemology, the theory of knowledge, holds that, in objectivism, it holds that reason based upon perception is man's only means of knowledge. That concepts, which are the tools of reason, abstract ideas, not just perception, that's the start of reason, but the use of your concept forming faculty to see what's in common among different things, that is valid, that concepts grasp this world that we perceive, and that we can use logic. Logic is valid. Logic is necessary in order to draw the consequences of the conceptualization of the facts that you have done. So, for instance, if the essence of man is his rational faculty, then the use of logic says you can't pretend that men survive by wishing or feeling good. It's a fact that forming the concept of man ultimately leads you to that man survives because of his thinking mind. That's what lifted us out of the cave. So when, incidentally, this is not always understood, but when you define man as a rational animal, you're not just saying he's the only animal who thinks. He's the only animal with the power of reason. You're saying that's his ecological niche, except it is a niche. That's his tool of survival. That's how he makes it in a world of competing organisms. Going back to the fountainhead, Rourke, in his climactic courtroom speech, says man comes on earth unarmed. His brain is his only weapon. He doesn't have protective armor like some animals. He doesn't have great speed of running like the cheetah. He doesn't have huge size like the elephant. He doesn't have claws like like the tiger, although it's also got huge muscles. He's pretty puny, but he has a brain. So he can invent spears, he can tame fire, and he can conquer the animal world just by those two things alone. There's much more, obviously, that reason brings you. So if you say the concept of man, denoting a being of whom all that's true, has a certain nature, he is what he is, and the consequences of dealing with him some other way are what they are, whether you like it or not, then you can't do something like pass a spending bill and hope that inflation won't occur, because this spending bill is financed by inflation at the point of a gun. The government money is forced upon us. It's not like we're allowed to trade gold and make gold clause contracts. The government money is legal tender. So force is used to make the paper money acceptable. And what is force? It's the negation of individual thought. Force says, don't act the way you think you should. Act the way I, with the gun, say you should. So this is supposed to be, it's a rather complicated example. I should have picked an easier one, but this is an example of if concepts are valid and things are what they are, then the attributes of things that you are using to conceptualize have causal implications that you can't flout. You have to behave a certain way. You can't demand that man crawl on all fours and graze like a cow, or attempt to fly like a bird, or attempt combat with a grizzly bear. You've got to respect his means of survival if you expect human beings to survive. And that means of survival is acting on your own judgment, your own rational thinking, not taking orders. Taking orders is self-destructive and other destructive. So that's the political example stemming from the concept of man is valid. I guess a simpler example would be the concept of a triangle, a three-sided plane figure, right? And from that, certain things follow logically, like its angle sums will add to be 180 degrees. And that two of its sides can be equal, in which case, if the two sides are equal, the base angles opposite each will be equal. And all the, side angle, side angle, side angle, all those things we had in high school geometry are the application of logic to what follows from a three-sided plane figure. So in epistemology, concepts are valid, reason is valid for Ayn Rand and Objectivism, and a special kind of rational product, principles, are valid. Principles. When she says, I'm not brave enough to be a coward, I see the consequences too clearly. The seeing there is intellectual. She doesn't have a crystal ball. And what intellectual product allows you to see consequences long range? Principles. That's what principles exist to do. If it's perceptually obvious, you push this thing, it's going to move. You don't have to have Newton's laws for that. But if it's not perceptually obvious, then you do have to have principles to govern that. And the role of principles in objectivism, and this is unique, I think, the role of principles, and especially moral principles, is cognitive. It's epistemological. It's to inform you. It's not a rule or a commandment, thou shalt not sell out. Thou shalt not cave into pressure. the principle of courage, which she is implicitly saying here, the principle of courage is a cognitive, it's like a telescope, cognitive tool telling you that if you act short range and do the cowardly thing, one aspect of reality or another will come back to bite you and bite you hard. So in this little statement, one sentence of Ayn Rand, she's relying on a whole theory of concepts and propositions and fundamental propositions, which are principles, and that they are not just, don't do this, don't lie. It's saying lying will bring bad consequences to you. Now we get to the cherry on the cake. What do we mean bad consequences? Suppose Ayn Rand had given in to pressure and not testified, or even more dramatically, gone up and testified, you know, this anti-Soviet hysteria is hysteria, it's paranoia. There are people just like you and I. They're really no different in Russia than they are here. And there should be more movies like Song of Russia, which was the one she was testifying, because they humanize and normalize our relations. After all, it's a scary world and we need friends. Now, if she had said that, there would be a host of consequences. How do you know they're bad? You know, tensions would have been relaxed. People on the left would have been very happy. So what do we mean bad? Well, Ayn Rand means bad for you, the person taking the action. Bad for you who is making the choice. And what is the ultimate bad? Death. What is the ultimate good? Life. Ayn Rand's ethics is an ethics of life, as opposed to the traditional ethics, like the Christian ethics, which are ethics premised on death. So when she thinks it's bad to compromise, it's bad to give in, it's bad to not do the courageous thing, she is saying bad for me in the long run. That's going to be like Rourke allowing his building to be bastardized. It's going to undercut my career, my values, my friends who expect me to stand up. I'll lose friends, and my husband won't know what to make of it. He will be very troubled by her husband, who's very strongly anti-communist. And so it was for her life that she wanted to have good consequences. I mean, that's what good means in objectivism. That which is proper to your life as a being who survives by reason. So you see in all those ways and others that I haven't touched upon, those are the ones that jumped out at me. That one little statement is saying, there is a reality, it is what it is, cause and effect cannot be evaded. Your consciousness is your willingness to see, well, no, your consciousness is your perception of reality. Your free will, that's an issue I didn't remember to cover. Your free will is your choice to perceive reality or not to. And then the epistemology of reason, that to perceive, to apprehend reality beyond just seeing what's right in front of you, is to use reason. And the best product of reason, one of the best, is principles, which tell you that a certain course is headed towards death and a different course is headed towards life and happiness. And in fact, she did make the right choice, and her life was happy. She went on to write Atlas Shrugged and change the history of the world. So we haven't seen much of that change yet, but we see the beginnings. So it worked for her. You know, she was asked, "Does your philosophy work for you?" And she says, "Yes, it has always worked for me, just like it works for the characters in my novels." So that is probably enough on that one sentence. But, you know, I can't praise it too much. I risk doing that now, but it is so unique. It's not like, oh, Gore Vidal or Truman Capote ever came out with a witticism like that, or had the ideas behind it. They have, some of these people have witticisms, and some of them are quite funny. Oscar Wilde, you know, to go back sometime, very funny, very witty, but nothing with this philosophical depth. So this alone would give Ayn Rand a place in history if anybody ever had the understanding of what metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics lie behind it. All right, that's what I wanted to say about that. I'll give you one more quip before we close. We have 2 minutes left. Typical Ayn Rand, cut from the same cloth. Now, I don't know this one actually happened. It was a story told while she was alive by people who knew her. Back in the antediluvian days of the 50s, restrooms often had their toilet stalls require money to go in. So you'd have to drop a dime or a quarter into a little, you know, coin machine to get in to the toilet. And the story was that Ayn Rand went into the ladies' room and was waiting outside for a stall to open. A woman finished and got out, and she saw Ayn Rand was waiting. So she held the door open for her so that she could skip the paying of the quarter. And she is supposed to have said, "If I were going to sell my soul, do you think I would do it that cheaply?" That's someone who acts on principle and knows that if you cheat somebody in one instance, you betrayed the principle. You're like the Manhattan Bank building with a Greek portico on it, Greek facade, and you're finished unless you really make up for it somehow. So I think that one is a little gross to go into, but I feel justified in doing it to show that she really lived by these principles that she enunciated. Okay, it's 4:30 here. Thank you very much. Next week will be another question and answer period, which we're calling Ask Harry, or Ask Harry Anything. So I know we have a bunch of questions. Actually, Daniel, you wanted me to take up one or two now rather than postpone them. I can do that. I can say a little later.
Okay. Yeah, they're in the chat.
They're in the chat. Okay. What is your latest theory on consciousness? On what consciousness is? Its nature, is it a type of energy? No, it's not a type of energy. Its nature is reality. Its nature is to be an awareness of reality. I don't have a latest theory or an older theory on consciousness, except that it is secondary. It is dependent on existence. It's the awareness of that which is, of that which exists. So its nature, Is it a type of energy? No, it's not a type of energy. I don't know. People use energy in philosophy in a way that's not used in physics. In physics, energy means 1/2 mv squared, half of the mass times the velocity squared. That is m/2 times v squared. That's kinetic energy. And the other is potential energy, which is potential to transform into or to realize, to actualize the moving, the energy of moving. It said the potential energy is energy of position, whereas kinetic energy is energy of motion. So if I raise my mouse up here, yeah, if I let it go, which I'm not going to do, it would fall because it has energy by my lifting it above the surface where it would rest in a gravitational field. So both of them are very concrete physical things, and consciousness is not a kind of motion, and it's not a kind of position. So no, I would never use the term energy in philosophy, unless you're talking about ethics and you say he's an energetic guy, meaning he has a lot of motivation and does a lot of things. Next one. Harper. That incident was from Apollo Zeus. Harper asks, is long-term poverty and unemployment a creation of statism? I don't see how destitution could exist with the amount of wealth creation that would be produced under pure freedom. Well, it's worse than that. There isn't any destitution in the West, in the first world countries. There's no destitution, unless you talk about self-made destitution. People who are alcoholics and lie in the street with clutching a bottle. But there's no, go outside of your home, go down any street where there's shops, and you'll see we're hiring. Everybody who wants a job can get a job and then some. There aren't enough people who are willing to work today. Now, that's a temporary condition. Under even semi-free conditions, the supply and demand balance. The supply of labor meets the demand for labor, which is the producers' offers of salaries because they think they can sell the product of that labor for more than they pay for the salary and more than other expenses. So there's no problem of unemployment. That's a problem in the mind of Keynesianism. Just like there's no problem of underutilization of pencils or uncomputerization. The price of pencils and the price of computers settles out at where the supply of them will equal the demand for them. So anytime you have an oversupply or a shortage, it's due to interference with the law of supply and demand. Even with a lot of interference, it'll still work out because people want money. People will find ways to hire on the sly. They'll hire illegal aliens. They will raise the price above what they're supposed to charge with the unions in control of wages or the government in control of wages. So people will get around the barriers either openly or sneakily, either through legal loopholes or illegal activity. And in general, in most not totalitarian societies, in societies that are at least semi-free, where they have money and they trade, you will find that the only unemployment that's there is either voluntary or due to some interference, like the minimum wage law. There's one thing that creates unemployment, and economists know this. Even left-wing economists know that minimum wage laws create unemployment. I won't go into why, but it's well known. You can look it up on the web. It's not even really controversial. So there is no destitution in the West, and the scandal of the left is that over the last 30 years, huge, large-scale destitution on a level Americans couldn't dream about was wiped out. I'm talking about India and China. Go see the movie, or you don't have to go see anymore. Get it on Netflix, Slumdog Millionaire. It's a movie about India, and the character is born in rags, living over a dung heap, which he sorts through for things that he might find in the human feces. That's how he makes his living. And by the end, and there are lots of people there doing that. By the end, about 25, 30 years later, there are skyscrapers where these shacks over the dung heaps were. Why? Because they moved away from socialism quite dramatically and moved towards semi-free markets. Same for China. In 1974, I think it was, during one of Mao's crusades, the Great Leap Forward, or one of those sloganed activities where he tried to force people not to be human. The starvation was so bad, particularly in the countryside, that I read in the New York Times that mothers traded babies to kill and eat. They couldn't bear to kill and eat their own babies, but they were starving, so they swapped babies, killed them, and ate them. New York Times Magazine, I've got the clipping. Now, China moved also away from communism under, I think it was Deng was his name, in the 80s or 70s even, late 70s, early 80s. And as a consequence, China has become a almost first world country. And we know the story about it. We know how the largest shopping center in the world is in China, not in the US. So the scandal, what's the scandal here? Total silence from the left. It's not like you've ever read in the article, boy, isn't it great how India has progressed over the, I mean, more people have been lifted out of abject starvation level poverty than ever, in a quicker time than has ever happened in history. No, they won't tell you that. They don't want to look at that because the reason is clear. It's because they move towards a market economy. And the socialists aren't concerned with human well-being. They're concerned, no, I know you're thinking power. No, they're not concerned with power. I mean, some of them are, of course. They're concerned with punishing the successful for being the successful. They're consumed by the leaders, not every Democrat or anything, but the animating spirit of the progressives is hatred of the good for being the good, to use another phrase of Ayn Rand's. So you're being propagandized to think, well, there's long-term poverty. There's long-term poverty in probably Uganda, where it's a dictatorship, and in all the dictatorships, they're in big trouble. And that's why I think that Xi in China is going to fall. because he's clamped down. He's moved back towards dictatorship, and that's going to wreck the economy. It's already doing that. And I think they're going to depose him because of that. I hope so. I also think Putin is going down. That's because of principles. Putin is brave enough to be a coward. Okay, thank you very much. More questions and answers next Monday.